I have so many forces. How can you be winning this battle?
Master.
They believe they have won the day, but they celebrate too soon. This cannot be allowed to stand. China will make things right.
Yes. Ready for orders.
Give me a job. What is it? Is it clear? I'm listening.
Yes. Understood.
Give me a job.
We have spotted survivors. Ground assault will be necessary.
Yes, sir. Immediately.
Unit lost.
Standing attention. Yes. Standing attention. Right away. Yes,
What is
sir.
it? Let's move.
Ready for orders. Right away.
Look, oil
Their
derricks.
building is
Should
ours.
we capture them?
I'm listening. Is it clear?
Standing attention.
I'll get through. Let's move.
Yes. Moving now, sir. Defenders of peace.
Need a transfer. Is it clear? What is it? Let's move.
The People's Army. Understood. Moving now, sir.
Unit lost.
Yes, sir.
Give me a job. That's right.
Standing attention. Moving now, sir. Yes, sir. Understood.
Unit lost.
Immediately. Yes, sir.
I'll get through.
We are the Red Guard. Moving now, sir. The middle.
Need a transfer.
The People's Army. Garrison the building. We are the Red
Give me a
Guard.
job. Is it clear?
Black Lotus has been discovered.
Need a transfer. Uplink available. Their Their building is ours.
We'll tear through their armor. We stand together. We'll tear through their armor.
Give me a job.
Let's build.
We'll tear through their armor.
No
We
problem.
stand together.
Of course.
We stand together. We'll tear through their armor. Tear through their armor. We stand together. We'll
We
tear
have
through
big
their armor.
plans. It will look real nice
We'll
when
tear
it's
through
done.
their armor. We stand
I'm listening.
together. We stand together.
Watch my back.
We stand together. We'll tear through their armor. Tear through their armor. We stand together. We'll tear through their armor. We'll tear through their armor. We stand together.
May I suggest that we garrison several of the nearby buildings to defend our base? Upgrade complete.
We'll tear through their armor. We stand together. We'll tear through their armor. Ready for orders. That building
We
looks
have
safe.
big
Tear through their armor.
plans. China has
We
been
stand
generous.
together.
Of course. I built for China. We have big plans.
Give me a job. I'm going in.
We will live in prosperity.
We
Their
are the
building
Red
is
Guard.
ours.
Garrison the building. Yes. We fight from high place. That building looks safe.
Need a transfer. Their building is ours.
Enemy tanks out there.
China has been generous.
Ready for orders. Yes. We will station there. I'm carrying the big gun.
I'll get through.
We will live in prosperity.
What is it?
We'll tear through their armor. We stand together. We stand together.
Is it clear?
Tear through their armor. We'll tear through their armor.
Let's
We'll
build.
tear through their armor.
We will live in
We'll
prosperity.
tear through their armor.
Of course.
We stand together. We stand together. We'll tear through their armor. 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 We stand together. We stand together. We'll tear through their armor. We stand together. Their armor. We are the Red Guard. Understood. We stand together. We stand together. We'll tear through their armor. We'll tear through their armor. Enemy tanks out there. Back down the enemy. We stand together.
I'm going in.
Unit
We
lost.
will live in prosperity.
Their building is ours.
Standing attention.
Let's build.
On the hunt. Track down the enemy. Let's fight the tank.
China has been generous. That's a good start.
The People's Army.
What is it? Sure. Let's move. I'm listening.
I built
Yes.
for China.
Right away. That building looks safe. Fight them! Drive them out!
Unit lost.
We fight from high place. On the hunt.
Congratulations, General. You have been promoted.
Moving rocket launcher. Get them.
Unit lost.
Carry some big guns.
Unit lost.
We stand together. We stand together. We stand together. We stand together.
Unit lost.
We stand together. 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 We stand together.
Unit
we stand
lost.
Together. We stand 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 together. We stand
Need a transfer.
We stand together. 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 I like the big targets. Enemy tanks out there? Let's wheel. Stand together.
Unit lost.
We stand together. We stand together. Yes. Garrison the building. Defenders of peace for the Republic. They cannot destroy China. Ready for order. That building looks safe.
I'm listening.
We are the Red Guard. I build for China. Defenders of peace.
Give me a job. That's right.
We are the Red Guard. Moving now, sir. Immediately. Immediately.
Unit lost.
We will station them. Immediately. Hold up in that building. That building looks safe.
I'll get through. Sure. Quickly. Sure.
Defenders of peace.
What is it?
We will live
Yes.
in prosperity.
Ready for orders. Standing attention. Yes, sir. We stand together. We stand together. We stand together. Immediately. We will station there. We stand together. 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 Ready for orders. We stand together. We stand together. We stand together. We fight from high place. Garrison the building. We fight from high place. We stand together. We stand together. We stand together. We stand together. Standing attention. Hold up in that building. We will station there. Building looks safe. We stand together. We stand together. We stand together. We stand together.
Congratulations, Jenny. You have been promoted. The American microwave tank is a big microwave gun that disables structures and vehicles. The radiation from the tank can also hurt infantry, so keep our men at a safe
HBM
distance.
vehicle standing by. Microwave emitters ready. Moving wave generators. Modulating pulse width.
Unit lost.
Need a transfer. That's right. What is it?
Ready for orders. Moving now, starting attention. Ready for orders.
Microwave weapons cleared for battle.
Defenders of peace. Ready for orders. Garrison the building.
Prepared for signal distortion. Frequency jammers on standby. Noise level set.
HBM vehicle standing by.
We have big plans.
Defenders of peace.
Prepare
We
for
will live
signal
in
distortion.
prosperity.
Defenders of peace.
Give me a job. I'll get through.
Standing attention. We will station there. Yes. Hold up in that standing attention. The People's Army. Ready for orders. The People's Army.
Their building is ours.
We'll tear through their
We
armor.
stand together. We stand together.
We'll tear through their armor. We'll tear through their armor.
We stand together. Ready
We'll
for
tear
orders.
through their
We
armor.
stand together.
Understood.
We stand together.
We'll tear through their armor. We'll tear
Emission
through
rate
their armor.
steady.
We stand together.
Frequency jammers on
HBM
standby.
vehicle standing We'll by. tear through their
Missiles
armor.
won't get through.
together. We stand
Inputting
together.
coordinates. Frequency jammers on
We'll
standby.
tear through their armor. We'll
Noise
tear
level
through their
set.
armor.
We stand
Xuyang
together.
tank.
We'll
Resetting
tear
navigation
through
We
their
stand
system.
together. We stand together.
We'll tear through their armor. We'll tear through their armor.
We stand together. We stand together. We are the Red Guard. Together. Ready for orders.
Unit lost.
We will station there. Yes. Standing attention. China's rocket soldier.
Unit lost. Congratulations, General. You have been promoted. Unit lost.
Mission rate steady. Understood.
Unit lost.
Defenders of peace. Moving now, sir. We stand together. 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 Stand together.
We'll tear through their armor. Tear through their armor. Tear through their armor.
We stand together.
Power coupling optimized.
We stand together. We stand together. We stand together. Defenders of peace. We stand together.
We'll tear through their armor. Tear through their armor. Tear through their armor.
We stand together. We stand together. We stand together. We stand together. That building looks safe.
Tear through their armor.
Yes. We will station there.
We stand together. We stand together.
Ready for orders.
We stand together.
We are the Red Guard.
HPM vehicle
Ready for
standing
orders.
by.
Unit lost.
Holding rocket launcher. Yes. Track down the enemy. Track down the enemy.
Unit lost. Unit lost.
Understood. Right away.
We'll tear through their armor. We stand together.
Power
We
coupling
stand together.
optimized. Wavelengths calibrated.
Ready for orders.
We stand together. We stand together. We stand together.
Microwave emitters ready.
We'll tear through their armor.
We fight
Tear
from
through
high
their
place.
armor.
Power coupling optimized.
We stand together. We stand together. We stand together. We stand together. We
Target
stand
location
together.
set.
We'll tear through their armor. We stand together. We stand together.
Standing attention.
Unit lost.
Hold up in that building.
Together. We stand together.
Yes.
We'll tear through their armor. We'll tear through their armor. We stand together. We stand together.
Frequency
we stand
jammers on
together.
standby.
We'll tear through their armor. We stand together. We stand together.
Ready for orders.
We
will station there.
We stand together. We stand together. We stand together.
The People's Army. Garrison the building.
We'll tear through their armor. Tear through their armor.
Need a transfer. Watch my back.
We stand together.
Standing attention.
Microwave weapons ready for battle.
China's rocket soldier. Yes, General.
Congratulations, General. You have been promoted.
Their building is ours.
Unit lost.
I'm carrying the big gun. Down the enemy. Yes, General.
The People's Army. Immediately. We are the Red Guard.
Unit lost.
Immediately. Understood.
Microwave emitters ready.
Defenders of peace. Immediately.
Adjusting frequency.
We stand
Standing
together.
attention.
We stand together. We
Right
stand
away.
together.
We'll
We
tear
stand
through their
together.
armor.
We stand
Understood.
together.
Power
We
coupling
stand together.
optimized.
We stand
Escalating energy
together. We
pulse.
stand together. We stand together. We'll tear through their armor. We stand together. We stand
Modulating
together.
pulse.
We stand together.
Maintaining
We stand
wavelength
together.
integrity.
We stand together.
Target location set.
We stand together.
Yes.
We stand together.
We'll tear
We
through
stand
their armor.
together. We stand together.
Yes, sir.
Unit lost.
Understood.
HPM vehicle standing by. Moving way generator.
Hold up in that building. Immediately.
Unit lost.
Understood. Garrison the building. Yes, sir.
We stand together.
Moving now, sir.
Wavelengths calibrated. HPM vehicle standing by.
We are the Red Guard.
Unit lost.
Building looks safe. Sending attention. Immediately. Ready for order. We have plenty of
Unit
seats.
lost.
Sending attention. Ready for order. Yes, sir. Understood. Right away. Immediately.
Unit lost.
Understood. Right away.
HPM vehicle standing by. Target location set.
We'll get the location.
Yes.
Unit lost.
We stand together.
HPM vehicle standing by.
Unit lost.
We are the Red Guard.
Together. We stand 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 together.
Initiating microwave surge.
Together.
Escalating energy pulse.
Together.
Initiating microwave surge.
Unit lost.
The Red Guard.
Microwave surge.
Unit lost.
Standing by.
We will station there.
Power coupling optimized.
We stand together.
Ready for order.
Power coupling optimized. Initiating microwave
Unit lost.
Defenders of peace.
Unit lost.
HPM vehicle standing by. Moving way generator.
Unit lost.
Sending attention. Yes, sir. Right away. Yes, sir.
Unit lost.
Ready for order. Right away. Yes, sir. Sending attention.
We stand together. We stand.
We are the Red Guard.
Together. We stand together.
Understood.
Unit
We stand
lost.
together. We stand together. We stand together. We stand together. We stand together.
Unit lost. Unit lost.
Defenders of peace.
Stand together.
We fight for fighting army.
We stand
Hold up
together.
in that building.
We stand
Ready for
together.
orders.
We
Unit
stand
lost.
together. We stand 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 together. We stand
Unit lost.
We stand together. 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 We stand together.
Missiles
We
won't get
stand
through.
together. We stand together.
Microwave
We
emitters
stand
ready.
together. We stand together. We stand together. We stand together. We
Microwave
stand
ready.
together. We stand together. We stand together. We
Power
stand
coupling
together.
optimized.
We stand together. 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 We stand together.
Microwave
We
weapons
stand
cleared for
together.
battle.
We stand together. We stand together.
Microwave
We
emitters
stand
ready.
together. We stand together.
Microwave
We
weapons cleared
stand
for
together.
calibrated. Adjusting
We
systems
stand
for
together.
transport.
We stand together. We stand together.
Microwave
We stand
emitters ready.
together.
Weapons
We
cleared for
stand
battle.
together. We stand together. We stand together.
Unit lost.
We stand
Microwave
together.
weapons cleared for battle.
We stand together. Defenders of peace. We stand together. Garrison the building. We are the Red Guard.
I'm listening. Let's move.
Unit lost.
Wavelengths calibrated. Moving wave generator optimized. Modulating pulse width. Moving wave generators. Wavelengths
Unit lost.
Yes, immediately.
HPM vehicle standing by. Frequencies amplified. Microwave emitters ready. Power coupling optimized. HPM vehicle standing by. Target location set.
Ready for order.
Power coupling optimized.
Sending attention.
HPM vehicle standing by. Microwave emitters ready.
Unit lost.
Ready for order.
Power coupling optimized.
Unit lost.
Sending attention. Garrison the building. Yes.
Microwave emitters ready. Power coupling
We are the Red Guard.
Unit lost.
modulating pulse width. Microwave emitters ready. Power coupling optimized.
The People's Army.
HPM vehicle standing by.
Defenders of peace.
Wavelengths calibrated. Microwave emitters ready.
Ready for order.
Unit lost.
Moving down, sir. We will station down. Ready for order. Down middle, pick up.
HPM vehicle standing by. Ready.
Ready for order. Yes, sir.
Power coupling optimized. Wavelengths calibrated. Microwave emitters ready.
Unit lost. Unit lost. Unit lost.
We stand together. We stand together. We stand together. Ready for order. Shoot them down. We stand
Unit
together.
lost.
We stand together. Moving We now, stand sir. together. Yes, sir. We stand
Microwave
together.
weapons
We stand
optimized.
together. We stand
Escalating
together.
energy pulse.
Unit lost.
We stand
Microwave weapons
together.
cleared for
We
battle.
stand
Need a transfer.
together. We stand together.
Is it clear? Sure. Got it.
We stand together. We stand together. We stand together.
Unit lost.
HVM vehicle standing by. Moving wave
We
generator.
stand together! We stand together!
Testing systems for
The
track.
people's army, immediately! Right away!
Microwave emitters ready. Wave generators activated.
Ready for orders! Yes, sir!
Give me a job. Quickly. That's right.
Emission rate
I'll get
steady.
through.
Frequency
Need a
jammers on
transfer.
standby.
I'll get through. They're building. Give me a job. Ours. Let's move. Uplink available.
HVM vehicle standing by.
I'll get through. They're building.
Our
it
base
out.
is being attacked!
Microwave emitters ready.
Unit lost.
Moving now, sir!
Need a transfer. Ready for transfer.
Ready for orders!
Unit lost.
Immediately!
Microwave emitters ready.
They're building.
We are the
it
Red
out.
Guard! Yes, sir!
Wavelengths calibrated. Cook 'em.
Defenders of peace! The People's Army!
What is it? I'll be in and out.
We are the Red
Unit
Guard!
lost.
Need a
They're
transfer.
attacking
out.
our base!
Ready for transfer.
Ready for orders!
Upgrade complete. Unit lost.
Understood.
Emission rate
I'll get
steady.
through.
Unit
I'm going
lost.
in. Quickly. I'll be in and out.
Defenders of peace! Moving now, sir!
Power coupling optimized.
I'm listening. They're building.
Watch
it
my
out.
back.
HVM vehicle standing by. Escalating energy pulse.
Chain gun upgrade is
Power
complete.
coupling optimized.
They're building. it out. Let's do it.
Wavelengths calibrated. Frequencies
They're building.
amplified.
it out. Need a transfer. What is it?
Our base is under attack!
Give me a job. Ready for
We are
transfer.
the Red Guard! Defenders of peace!
I'll get through. Uplink available.
Ready for orders! Yes, sir! Yes!
Their building is ours. What is it?
We are the Red Guard!
HVM vehicle standing by.
Yes! Ready for orders!
Their building is ours. Give me a job.
Unit
Let's do it.
lost.
Standing attention! Garrison the building! Hold up in that building! Immediately!
Their building is ours.
Defenders of peace! Moving now, sir!
I'll get through.
The People's Army!
Their building is Give me a job.
Microwave emitters ready.
I'll get through. I'll be in and out. Need a transfer. Their building is Let's do it.
The terrorist threat is finished. Good work, General. We are victorious.